Something was wrong with Australia, not the Australia that exists today with its familiar coastlines and sunburned plains, but the Australia that existed 120 million years ago, when the rules that governed life on every other continent simply did not apply here. This was a place where the largest predators on Earth were not at the top, where darkness swallowed the land for weeks at a time, where shallow seas rose and swallowed entire habitats without warning, and where evolution took directions that scientists are still struggling to fully explain. This was not simply a strange corner of the ancient world. It was a place that actively defied the patterns seen everywhere else, producing ecosystems, creatures, and survival strategies that had no real equivalent on any other landmass. To understand why, we have to go back further than most people imagine, back to a time when Australia was not an island at all, when it sat pressed against other continents in the deep south of the world, locked in darkness for months at a time, flooded by inland seas that came and went without warning, and ruled by predators that should not have existed in the form they took. Please let us know in the comments where you're watching this history video and what time you're watching it. And be sure to subscribe to the channel for future videos. Tonight, we are going back to that world. We are going to walk through every layer of it, from the ground shifting beneath ancient feet to the sky filled with creatures that blurred the line between flight and nightmare. We are going to understand not just what lived here, but why this place produced something that nowhere else on Earth managed to create. The story of ancient Australia is not simply a catalogue of strange animals. It is the story of what happens when a landscape itself becomes the architect of life, when isolation, darkness, flooding, and relentless pressure combine to push evolution into territory it had never explored before. To begin that story, we have to start with the land itself, because the land was the first force that shaped everything else. Long before its familiar outline took shape, the landmass that would become Australia was not a separate place. It was a quiet interior portion of something far larger, a continuous expanse of joined continents stretching across the southern half of the planet, in a configuration that feels almost impossible to visualize from the present. This ancient supercontinent known as Gondwana held within its borders what would eventually become South America, Africa, India, Antarctica, and Australia, all pressed together in a slow and shifting arrangement that had persisted for hundreds of millions of years. There were no oceans separating these regions. Life could move across them without interruption, following pathways that stretched for thousands of kilometers without a single body of water to block the way. Within this arrangement, the portion of Gondwana that would become Australia sat far to the south, closer to the pole than it rests today. This positioning was not incidental. It was the first and most fundamental force that would define everything about how life developed here. Latitude shapes light, and light shapes everything else. In the deep south, the sun did not follow the same reliable arc that it traces across equatorial skies. Instead, it moved in long, shallow paths that stretched across summer horizons for weeks before retreating entirely during the polar winter. This meant that the land experienced extended periods of continuous daylight followed by prolonged stretches of near-total darkness, a pattern that had no parallel in the warmer regions where most of the ancient world's largest ecosystems were developing. This was not Antarctica as we understand it today, locked beneath permanent ice and stripped of complex life. The Cretaceous world was warmer across all latitudes, and even these southern regions remained free from the ice sheets that would later define polar environments. Temperatures here were cool but not frozen, and the land supported genuine forests, genuine ecosystems, genuine diversity. Yet the light was wrong in ways that created pressures unlike anything experienced further north. Plants that depended on photosynthesis had to manage through months of minimal sunlight. Animals that depended on those plants had to find ways to endure intervals when food production slowed or stopped. Predators that depended on both had to adapt their behavior to conditions where visibility itself became unreliable for extended periods. The result was an ecosystem shaped from its earliest development by a rhythm that forced compromise. Every organism that survived here had already been selected for a degree of resilience that organisms in more equatorial environments simply did not need. The southern position was not just a geographical fact. It was an evolutionary filter, and it had been filtering life here for millions of years before the Cretaceous period began to express its most remarkable chapter. As the Cretaceous progressed, the arrangement of Gondwana began to change. The immense plates of the Earth's surface, never truly still, began shifting in ways that slowly stretched the connections between these southern landmasses. This was not a sudden splitting or a visible fracture. It was a process measured in millions of years, where distances grew by centimeters per year, accumulating across time into separations that eventually became oceans. The pathways that had allowed life to move freely across the southern world began to narrow. Routes that had once been continuous land became increasingly interrupted by shallow marine expanses, then by deeper water that could no longer be crossed. Populations that had shared common ancestry across vast distances began to find themselves confined to smaller and smaller regions, cut off from the genetic exchange that had previously connected them to the broader world. For the landmass that would become Australia, this separation carried profound consequences. As it began to drift away from Antarctica and from the broader Gondwanan mass, it took with it the life that was already present, the species that had already been shaped by southern conditions, already filtered by darkness and seasonal extremes, already adapted to a world that demanded more of its inhabitants than most regions required. These organisms now found themselves on a slowly separating island continent, carrying their unique heritage with them into increasing isolation. The drift itself was not the only force reshaping the land. Beneath the surface, the geological processes that drive continental movement also influence the height and configuration of the ground above. As the plate carrying this landmass shifted, regions that had once been elevated began to subside, and the relationship between the land's surface and sea level began to change in ways that would transform the interior of the continent into something few people today would recognize. During the Cretaceous, global sea levels were significantly higher than they are today. The warmth of the period meant that no substantial polar ice sheets existed, and the volume of water in the world's oceans was distributed differently. When this elevated sea level encountered a landmass where interior regions were subsiding, the result was predictable and dramatic. Water moved inland. Not in a single catastrophic flood, but in a gradual and persistent encroachment that, over millions of years, converted vast stretches of the Australian interior into something that did not resemble land at all. Shallow seas spread across the continent's interior regions, covering areas that had previously supported terrestrial life and replacing them with broad, gently sloping marine environments that stretched for hundreds of kilometers from the original coastlines. These were not the deep, cold oceans that surround the continent today. They were warm, shallow, and biologically rich, filled with life that took advantage of the nutrients carried into them and the stable temperatures maintained by a warmer global climate. Marine reptiles moved through their waters. Ancient relatives of modern fish populated their depths, and along their edges, where water met land in shifting boundaries, entirely different forms of life gathered at the intersection between two worlds. The presence of these inland seas did something to the Australian continent that would prove enormously significant for everything that followed. It broke the land apart. Where once there had been continuous stretches of habitable terrain, the advancing water created islands, peninsulas, and isolated patches of elevated ground separated from one another by varying depths of warm water. Life that had been able to move freely across broad areas now found itself confined to smaller regions, unable to cross the water barriers that had appeared between previously connected habitats. This fragmentation had immediate and long-term effects. In the short term, it concentrated populations into smaller areas, increasing the intensity of competition for resources that were now distributed across a reduced landmass. Animals that had previously been able to spread across large territories to reduce competition with one another now occupied the same restricted spaces, forced into closer and more frequent interaction. In the longer term, it accelerated the divergence of populations from one another, as groups separated by water could no longer interbreed, leading their respective lineages down increasingly distinct evolutionary paths. But the inland seas were not permanent. They rose and fell over millions of years in response to changing conditions, and their retreat was as significant as their advance. When sea levels dropped and water withdrew from the interior, it left behind landscapes shaped by its passage, flat sedimentary plains rich in the nutrients deposited by marine organisms, exposed terrain that had been altered by prolonged submersion, and new habitats that opened up where water had previously excluded terrestrial life. These retreating seas created opportunities, but they also exposed the organisms that had adapted to the fragmented landscape to new conditions and new pressures, requiring further adjustment. The combination of these forces, the southern position that created seasonal darkness, the gradual separation from Gondwana that isolated the landmass, and the repeated advance and retreat of inland seas that fragmented and reorganized the available habitat, created a foundation unlike anything found elsewhere on Earth. This was not simply a different continent. It was a different kind of place, one where the rules governing the development and distribution of life had been shaped by a unique combination of pressures applied over an enormous span of time. The climate that settled over this ancient Australian landscape reflected all of these influences. The global warmth of the Cretaceous period moderated temperatures even at high southern latitudes, preventing the extreme cold that might otherwise have made this region uninhabitable. But the warmth was not uniform. The position of the continent, its relationship to ocean currents, and the configuration of the land itself all created patterns of rainfall and temperature that varied significantly across different regions and across different times of year. Some areas received consistent precipitation that supported dense, continuous vegetation. Others experienced more variable conditions where plant communities could shift or diminish as the patterns of moisture changed. This climatic variability added another layer of instability to an already dynamic environment. Habitats were not static features of the landscape but living communities that responded to changes in rainfall, temperature, and the physical configuration of the land. A region that supported dense forest under one set of conditions might shift toward more open vegetation as moisture patterns changed, altering the resources available to every animal that depended on it. These shifts did not occur instantly, but they were persistent, accumulating over time in ways that required constant adjustment from the organisms living through them. For the ecosystems developing on this fragmenting, flooding, darkening continent, the result was an environment defined by impermanence. Nothing could be counted on to remain as it was. The land might flood, the light might disappear for weeks. The vegetation that had supported a population might diminish as rainfall patterns shifted. In such an environment, the organisms that could persist were those that carried the capacity for adaptation not as an occasional response to unusual circumstances, but as a continuous and fundamental aspect of their existence. This is where the story of ancient Australian life truly begins, not with specific animals or dramatic encounters, but with the recognition that the environment itself was the primary force shaping everything. Understanding what lived here, what ruled here, and what made this place so different from the rest of the ancient world requires understanding the world that produced it. A world of shifting seas, seasonal darkness, fragmenting habitats, and relentless pressure applied across millions of years to every living thing that called this place home. The ground beneath ancient Australia was never still in the way that firm and reliable Earth allows us to imagine. Even setting aside the deep geological processes of plate movement, the surface itself existed in a state of perpetual negotiation between land and water. The inland seas that spread across the continental interior were not fixed bodies with stable coastlines. They were dynamic systems whose boundaries shifted in response to the same forces that had created them, responding to fluctuations in global sea level, changes in regional subsidence, and the continuous redistribution of sediment that altered the depth and extent of their shallow waters. In some geological intervals, these seas expanded significantly, pushing their margins further into areas that had recently been dry. In others, they contracted, pulling back from regions that had briefly been submerged and exposing new stretches of land that had not seen sunlight in thousands of years. These fluctuations created a coastline that was never fixed, a constantly moving boundary between the terrestrial and marine worlds that shaped the distribution of life along its shifting edge. For organisms living near these margins, the advancing and retreating water represented both opportunity and threat. When seas expanded, habitats were lost, populations were displaced, and animals were forced to move toward higher ground where resources might already be fully occupied by established communities. Competition intensified as displaced organisms arrived in areas that had not previously been pressed by their presence. The carrying capacity of remaining terrestrial habitats was tested as more life was concentrated into less space. When seas retreated, the opportunity existed to recolonize newly exposed terrain, but this terrain was not immediately hospitable. Land that had been submerged for extended periods required time to develop the soil structure and vegetation communities that could support complex terrestrial ecosystems. The organisms best positioned to take advantage of newly exposed ground were those most capable of operating within impoverished environments, those that could establish themselves quickly and make use of limited resources while more complex communities were still developing. This cycle of advance and retreat created a landscape that was perpetually in various stages of ecological development. Mature, complex ecosystems existed alongside pioneer communities just beginning to establish themselves on newly exposed ground. The interactions between organisms from these different ecological stages added further complexity to a system already characterized by instability. The sediment deposited by these retreating seas left behind a record that scientists would eventually use to reconstruct the story of this ancient world. Layers of fine-grained material, the accumulated remains of marine organisms, and the preserved traces of life that had lived along these shifting margins all settled into sequences that captured different moments in the long oscillation of water across the continental interior. Within these layers, the bones of animals that had lived beside these seas were occasionally preserved, carried into depositional environments where the conditions favored their survival across millions of years. These fossil deposits became some of the most important sources of information about what life in ancient Australia looked like. The bones they contained, along with the teeth marks, growth patterns, and physical characteristics preserved within them, provided direct evidence of the animals that had inhabited this world. But they also carried indirect evidence about the conditions under which those animals had lived, the environments they had occupied, and the pressures that had shaped them. The vegetation that covered the terrestrial portions of this ancient landscape was itself a product of the unusual conditions that prevailed here. Plants growing in a region with pronounced seasonal light variation faced challenges that their counterparts in more equatorial regions did not encounter. The extended periods of reduced sunlight during polar winter required strategies for managing reduced photosynthesis, storing energy accumulated during productive seasons, and maintaining structural integrity through intervals when the energy budget was constrained. Ferns covered much of the ground's surface in dense, overlapping layers that held moisture close to the soil and created complex microhabitats beneath their fronds. These ancient plants, well established long before the Cretaceous, thrived in the conditions that prevailed here, their tolerance for variable light and moisture making them particularly well suited to an environment that did not offer consistent conditions. They formed the foundational layer of many plant communities, creating a living carpet across the landscape that supported a range of smaller animals and provided cover that larger species used for concealment. Above this ground layer, conifers rose with steady, persistent forms. Their needle-like leaves, adapted to manage reduced water loss and to remain functional across a range of conditions, gave them an advantage in the seasonally variable environment of southern Gondwana. These trees did not grow with the same rapid exuberance as tropical forests. They grew more deliberately, accumulating mass and height across longer intervals, their growth rings potentially recording the seasonal variation in light and moisture that characterized each year. The forests they formed were not the dense, closed canopies of equatorial regions, but more open structures where light reached the ground more consistently, supporting the fern communities below. Cycads added another element to this plant community, their heavy crowns and sturdy trunks marking them as survivors from an even earlier period of Earth's history. These ancient plants had persisted through multiple episodes of global change, and their presence in the Cretaceous Australian landscape reflected their remarkable capacity for endurance. They grew slowly, accumulated nutrients efficiently, and maintained themselves through conditions that might stress faster-growing species. For herbivores capable of processing their tough, chemically defended tissues, they represented a persistent and reliable, if challenging, food source. The earliest flowering plants were beginning to appear during this period, their presence still limited but their potential already evident in the range of environments they were beginning to colonize. These newcomers did not yet dominate the landscape, but they introduced variety into the plant communities, offering different textures, nutritional profiles, and structural forms that gradually expanded the possibilities for the animals that fed upon them. Their ability to reproduce and spread more rapidly than the older plant lineages gave them an advantage in disturbed environments, particularly in the areas repeatedly exposed and inundated by the advancing and retreating seas. For the herbivores that depended on these plant communities, the structure of the vegetation was not simply a backdrop to their existence. It defined the boundaries of their world, where plants grew densely, feeding was possible but movement was constrained. Where vegetation opened into more sparse arrangements, movement was freer but exposure increased and the quality of available food might be reduced. The seasonal variation in plant growth created periods of relative abundance followed by periods of scarcity, requiring herbivores to either store energy internally, migrate to regions where growth continued, or simply endure reduced intake until conditions improved. These challenges were not unique to ancient Australia, but they were expressed here with particular intensity, given the pronounced seasonality of the light regime and the instability of habitat boundaries created by the fluctuating seas. The result was a community of plant-eating animals that had been shaped by more demanding conditions than those faced by their counterparts elsewhere, animals that carried within their biology the marks of long exposure to an environment that did not offer consistent abundance. Understanding how these animals moved through their world requires understanding not just what they ate, but how the distribution of food shaped their behavior across different scales of time and space. Day to day, herbivores had to locate sufficient plant material to meet their energetic needs while managing the exposure that feeding inevitably created. Week to week, they responded to the availability of different plant types as some flourished and others diminished in different microhabitats. Season to season, they adjusted their position across the landscape to follow the shifting availability of productive vegetation, moving away from areas where growth had slowed and toward regions where it continued. These movements created patterns that extended across the landscape, connecting different habitats through the predictable travel of large animal populations. These patterns were not invisible to the predators that depended on them. They were instead the fundamental organizing structure of the predatory world, the underlying logic that determined where hunting opportunities could be found and how predators should position themselves within the landscape to take advantage of them. The relationship between plant communities, herbivore populations, and predator behavior formed an interconnected web that was sensitive to disruption at any point. A shift in rainfall that reduced plant productivity in one area would cause herbivores to move, which would require predators to adjust their own positioning, which would alter the competitive dynamics between different predatory species, which might influence which prey species were most heavily targeted, which could feed back into changes in herbivore population structure and movement. These feedback loops operated continuously, making the ecosystem a dynamic and responsive system rather than a static arrangement of fixed relationships. Within this web of interactions, some relationships were more direct than others, but none were truly isolated. The movement of water across the landscape influenced the distribution of plants. The distribution of plants shaped the movement of herbivores. The movement of herbivores defined the opportunities available to predators. And the behavior of predators influenced how herbivores used the landscape, closing a cycle that connected every element of the ecosystem to every other through pathways that might span the entire extent of the available habitat. What made ancient Australia distinctive was not the existence of these relationships, which are features of all ecosystems, but the intensity with which they operated. The fragmentation of the landscape into smaller patches by the inland seas compressed these interactions into reduced spaces. The seasonal extremes imposed by the southern latitude intensified the periodic scarcity that drove competition. The isolation from other continental regions prevented the dilution of local pressures by the influx of species from elsewhere. All of these forces combined to create an environment where the fundamental ecological relationships that govern life everywhere else were expressed with unusual force and consequence. Among the most remarkable features of ancient Australian ecology was what paleontologists have come to describe as an inverted predator hierarchy, a situation where the usual order of ecological dominance was reversed in ways that had no clear parallel anywhere else in the Cretaceous world. To appreciate how unusual this was, it is necessary to understand what was happening elsewhere during the same period. Across most of the Cretaceous world, a particular group of large carnivorous dinosaurs dominated the predator guild in the way that lions dominate African savannas today, not as the only predators present, but as the apex figures around which the rest of the ecological hierarchy organized itself. These were the carcharodontosaurids, enormous theropod dinosaurs that reached sizes comparable to Tyrannosaurus rex, with massive skulls, serrated teeth designed to deliver devastating wounds, and bodies built for overwhelming large prey through sheer physical force. In North America, South America, Africa, and Europe, these giants or their equivalents occupied the uppermost position in the food chain, the organisms that all other predators ultimately deferred to. In Australia, the situation was different in ways that continue to provoke scientific debate. The carcharodontosaurids were present, but they appear to have occupied a secondary position within the predatory hierarchy rather than the dominant role they held elsewhere. Something else was at the top. The evidence for this reversal comes from multiple lines of analysis, including the relative size of predatory animals recovered from Australian fossil sites, the patterns of interaction preserved in fossilized bone, and the broader ecological context suggested by the distribution of prey species and habitats. What occupied that apex position was a group of dinosaurs that were themselves extraordinary, representatives of a lineage that combined physical power with anatomical features, suggesting a style of predation quite different from the straightforward pursuit and bite strategies of the largest theropods. These animals carried large, strongly curved claws on their forelimbs, structures that appear designed not simply for striking prey from a distance, but for maintaining grip through close physical engagement. The biomechanical implications of these claws suggest a predator that operated differently from the giants that dominated elsewhere, one that relied on proximity, grappling, and sustained physical contact rather than the application of a single overwhelming bite. The bodies of these animals reflected this predatory approach in multiple ways. Their musculature was arranged to support powerful pulling motions with the forelimbs, allowing them to draw prey toward their bodies and maintain that contact against resistance. Their hind limbs provided a stable base for these engagements, and their overall body proportions suggested animals capable of sustained physical effort rather than brief explosive attacks. This was not a predator designed to knock down prey with a single strike and then step back. It was designed to hold on, to maintain engagement, to apply continuous force until the outcome was resolved. The presence of these animals at the apex of the Australian predatory hierarchy, in a position occupied elsewhere by much larger animals that operated very differently, raises profound questions about why this particular approach to predation proved so successful in this particular environment. Part of the answer may lie in the structure of the habitat itself. The fragmented, vegetation-rich landscapes created by the combination of inland seas and seasonally variable plant communities may have favored ambush and close contact predation over the open pursuit strategies that worked well in more expansive environments. A predator that could maintain a grip on struggling prey in dense vegetation, in narrow corridors between water bodies, in the constrained spaces of a fragmented landscape, had advantages that would not have been as significant in the open plains where the largest carcharodontosaurids thrived. The prey available in ancient Australia also differed from that found in many other Cretaceous ecosystems. The isolation of the continent meant that the herbivore community had developed its own distinctive character, shaped by the same pressures of fragmentation and seasonal extremity that had influenced every other aspect of the ecosystem. The animals available as prey in this environment were not necessarily the same sizes and types as those found in more northern regions, and predators that had evolved in response to local prey communities would reflect those specific conditions. Understanding the full picture of the Australian predatory world requires looking beyond just the largest carnivores to the entire network of predatory organisms that occupied different levels of the ecosystem. Large theropods, whether of the apex or secondary variety, shared the landscape with smaller carnivores that occupied their own distinct roles within the hierarchy. These smaller predators did not simply exist as lesser versions of the giants above them. They operated within their own ecological space, targeting prey that was inaccessible to larger animals, using habitats and movement strategies that would have been impractical for the biggest carnivores, and competing with one another for resources in ways that created their own complex dynamics. Among these smaller predators, animals that combined speed, agility, and sensory acuity played roles that complemented rather than duplicated those of the larger carnivores. They moved through the denser vegetation more easily, could pursue prey through terrain that would slow larger animals, and could exploit food sources that the apex predators would not bother with. Their presence added layers to the predatory community, creating a system where different sizes and styles of predator occupied different spaces within the broader ecological structure. The interactions between these different levels of the predatory hierarchy were themselves significant forces in shaping the system. Smaller predators had to manage their activities in relation to the larger animals that might take their prey or, in some circumstances, view them as prey themselves. Larger predators needed to be aware of the competitive dynamics that smaller carnivores represented, particularly in relation to access to carcasses and the maintenance of territory. These overlapping pressures created a complex web of relationships within the predatory community that extended well beyond the simple linear hierarchy suggested by size alone. Evidence of these interactions appears in the fossil record in the form of bite marks on bones that tell stories about who was feeding on what and in what sequence. The marks left by teeth of different sizes and shapes on the same bones reveal that multiple predators of different species engaged with the same carcasses, sometimes in overlapping timeframes. The patterns of these marks suggest not just sequential feeding by different species after the dominant predator had finished, but active competition and displacement with different animals attempting to access the same resource at the same time. In some cases, the marks on bones suggest that predators were feeding on other predators, indicating that the line between hunter and hunted was not always as clear as simple hierarchy might suggest. A large predator weakened by injury or old age could become a target for smaller carnivores, opportunistically taking advantage of a reversed situation. The fossil record captures these moments without judgment, preserving in mineral form the evidence of a system where roles could shift and where no animal's position was permanently secured. The presence of healed injuries on predator bones adds another dimension to this story. Bones that show fractures, puncture wounds, or other trauma that subsequently healed indicate that the animals carrying these injuries survived encounters significant enough to leave physical evidence. These survivors carried within their bones a record of conflict that had not ended their lives but had marked them permanently. The frequency with which such injuries appear in the fossil record of predatory animals suggests that direct physical conflict between predators, whether of the same species competing for territory or of different species competing for resources, was a regular feature of life in this environment rather than an exceptional event. The relationship between predators and their environment extended beyond the simple question of what they hunted. It encompassed the full range of ways in which large, active carnivores interact with the physical landscape and with every other species that shares it. Predators do not just remove prey from the system. They shape the behavior of every organism that lives within the range of their influence, altering where herbivores feed, how long they stay in any given location, what routes they travel, and how their populations are distributed across the landscape. These behavioral effects, which ecologists call the landscape of fear, can be as significant as the direct effects of predation itself. An animal that avoids a productive feeding area because of predator presence loses access to those resources, whether or not it is ever actually attacked. Populations that cluster together for safety spend more time monitoring for threats and less time feeding, potentially affecting their body condition and reproductive success. The indirect effects of predator presence ripple through the entire ecosystem, influencing every species that must adjust its behavior to account for the risk of being eaten. In the fragmented landscape of ancient Australia, these effects would have been particularly pronounced. The constrained habitat patches created by the inland seas meant that predators and prey were already operating in closer proximity than they might have been in more expansive environments. The behavioral adjustments that prey animals made in response to predator presence had to be implemented within smaller spaces, with fewer options for simply moving away from areas of high risk. The result was a more intense and continuous influence of predator behavior on the entire community. Herbivores responded to this pressure in ways that left their own marks on the fossil record and on the broader ecological structure. The tendency to form groups, which provides protection through shared vigilance and the dilution of individual risk, appears to have been a significant behavioral strategy for many of the large plant-eating animals of this period. Moving and feeding in groups did not eliminate the risk of predation, but it distributed that risk across multiple individuals and allowed the group collectively to maintain a higher level of awareness than any single animal could achieve alone. The structure of these groups was not random. Individuals within them occupied different positions based on their size, age, and condition, with more vulnerable animals tending toward the center where they were buffered by the bodies of others, and larger, more capable individuals at the periphery where the first contact with approaching predators was most likely. This spatial organization within groups represented a sophisticated response to predatory pressure, allowing the collective to function more effectively than the sum of its individual members. The movement patterns of herbivore groups across the landscape reflected the combined influence of resource distribution and predator avoidance. The need to find sufficient food pulled groups toward areas of productive vegetation, while the need to avoid predators pushed them away from areas where predators were likely to be present. The resulting movement patterns were the product of these competing pressures, tracing paths through the landscape that balanced access to food with management of predatory risk. In a fragmented landscape with multiple overlapping predator territories, finding routes that satisfied both requirements was a complex challenge. Areas of productive vegetation might coincide with areas of high predator activity, particularly if predators had learned to position themselves where prey was predictably concentrated. The most dangerous places in the landscape might be precisely the places where food was most abundant, forcing herbivores into a continuous negotiation between starvation and predation. The inland seas themselves played a role in this dynamic. Their edges represented zones where terrestrial animals needed to approach to drink, creating predictable gathering points that predators could exploit. The shallow margins of these water bodies also supported their own communities of organisms, some of which represented additional predatory threats to animals approaching from the land. The shoreline was simultaneously a necessary destination and one of the most dangerous locations in the landscape, a convergence of needs and risks that shaped how every terrestrial animal related to the water boundaries of their fragmented world. Marine predators that moved through the shallow inland seas added a dimension to the predatory landscape that had no equivalent in fully terrestrial environments. Large plesiosaurs and ichthyosaurs moved through waters that extended into the heart of the continent, their presence felt along every shoreline that marked the boundary between their world and the terrestrial world above. Animals approaching the water to drink entered a zone where threats could emerge from below without warning, where the visual cues that allowed detection of terrestrial predators were useless, and where the physical advantages of size and speed that might provide some protection on land offered little benefit. The intersection of these multiple predatory pressures, terrestrial apex predators, secondary carnivores, and marine hunters all operating within the same fragmented and compressed landscape, created a system of extraordinary complexity. Every animal in this world existed within a web of influences that extended from the ground beneath its feet to the waters beside it and the sky above it, with threats that could materialize from any direction and that required constant management of behavior and position. The sky above ancient Australia was not empty. Pterosaurs of various sizes moved through the air above this landscape, adding yet another dimension to the predatory web that permeated every level of the environment. These flying reptiles ranged from small, agile forms capable of quick maneuvering through complex terrain to larger species with wing spans that allowed them to travel considerable distances on thermal currents rising from the warm land below. From their elevated position, pterosaurs had access to a perspective on the landscape that no terrestrial animal could match. They could observe the movement of animals across open ground, tracking the patterns of herbivore groups, monitoring the positions of larger predators, and identifying the locations of food resources that might not be visible from ground level. This aerial vantage was not passive observation, but an active component of their predatory strategy, allowing them to locate opportunity across a wider area than any ground-bound hunter could survey. The descent from that vantage to a target on the ground was rapid and difficult to anticipate from below. An animal occupied with feeding or moving through terrain that limited its upward visibility might have little warning before an aerial predator closed the distance from considerable height. The shadow cast by large pterosaurs approaching from above might provide a moment of warning, but in terrain with variable light conditions, even that signal could be unreliable. The presence of aerial predators added an upward dimension to the awareness that ground-dwelling animals needed to maintain. In addition to monitoring the terrestrial environment for approaching predators and the water margins for marine threats, animals in this landscape also needed to attend to the sky, a demand that, when combined with the other vigilance requirements imposed by a complex predatory environment, created a substantial ongoing cognitive load. The time and energy devoted to threat monitoring was time and energy not available for feeding, resting, or reproduction, representing a real cost imposed by the density of predatory pressure in this environment. For smaller animals, pterosaurs represented an immediate and significant threat. Animals below a certain size were physically manageable targets for even mid-sized pterosaurs, and the aerial approach meant that the usual defensive strategies of group living and terrain use were less effective. Being within a group helped if the group collectively detected the approaching predator in time to respond, but an individual separated from its group, or in a position where the aerial approach was masked by terrain or light conditions, faced a very different situation. The pterosaurs themselves were not immune to the pressures of this environment. They occupied a predatory niche, but also existed within the broader competitive and physical context of the landscape. Their eggs and young were vulnerable to ground predators, and the sites they chose for nesting needed to balance accessibility with security. The demands of flight required high caloric intake, making them dependent on reliable food sources and sensitive to changes in prey availability. The coastal and shoreline environments that marked the boundaries of the inland seas were particularly important for certain pterosaur species, providing access to aquatic prey that supplemented their terrestrial hunting. Shallow water that exposed the bodies of fish or other aquatic organisms to a predator approaching from above represented an opportunity that pterosaurs with appropriate anatomical specializations could exploit efficiently. The convergence of terrestrial, marine, and aerial food chains along these coastal zones created environments of extraordinary ecological richness and complexity. The interactions between pterosaurs and the terrestrial predators below them were another aspect of this complex web. Large terrestrial carnivores and large pterosaurs occupied overlapping ecological space in some respects, both targeting animals in a range of sizes, and their presence in the same landscape created conditions where direct competition or opportunistic interactions might occur. A large pterosaur descending to feed on a terrestrial carcass might find itself in proximity to a carnivorous dinosaur with its own interest in the same resource. The outcome of such encounters would depend on the relative sizes and capabilities of the individuals involved, and the history of such interactions would have shaped how both pterosaurs and terrestrial predators behaved when they found themselves in proximity. Against this backdrop of layered predatory pressure, fragmented habitat, and seasonal environmental extremes, the biological processes that sustain populations across generations unfolded with their own urgent rhythm. Reproduction in this environment was not a leisurely activity, but a critical priority shaped by the need to replace individuals lost to predation, environmental fluctuation, and competition before those losses accumulated to the point where population viability was threatened. The nesting behavior of dinosaurs in ancient Australia reflected these pressures. Eggs represented the most vulnerable point in the reproductive cycle, immobile concentrations of parental investment that required both physical protection from predators and appropriate environmental conditions to develop successfully. Choosing a suitable nesting location was consequently one of the most significant decisions an animal could make, with implications for the survival of offspring that extended far beyond the moment of egg laying. The seasonal light regime of this southern landscape introduced complexities into nesting timing that did not apply in more equatorial regions. The extended periods of reduced light during the polar winter affected temperatures and the activity levels of both parents and potential nest predators, creating a temporal structure to reproductive opportunity that animals in more stable light environments did not need to navigate. Timing reproduction to take advantage of the most favorable conditions while avoiding the worst required biological systems tuned to the specific rhythms of this place. Evidence from related dinosaur species and from the broader Mesozoic record suggests that many dinosaurs exhibited some degree of parental behavior toward their nests and young, remaining near nesting sites to guard against predators or to provide warmth. In an environment with the level of predatory pressure seen in ancient Australia, such behavior would have had clear survival value. A nest guarded by a parent represented a very different target for a potential predator than an unguarded one, and the decision to approach such a nest required weighing the risk of confronting the parent against the nutritional value of the eggs. The growth rates of young dinosaurs after hatching were themselves a product of evolutionary pressure in high-risk environments. Species that grew quickly from the vulnerable small size of hatchlings to a larger size where they were no longer accessible to the full range of predators had a survival advantage over those that grew more slowly. The fossil record captures evidence of this through the structure of bone tissue, which preserves growth patterns in a way that allows paleontologists to estimate how quickly different species added mass during their development. In many Cretaceous dinosaur lineages, growth rates were significantly faster than those seen in living reptiles of comparable body plan, reflecting the evolutionary premium placed on moving through the vulnerable juvenile phase as quickly as possible. Even with rapid growth, the period between hatching and reaching a size that provided meaningful protection from predators was a time of extraordinary vulnerability. Juvenile dinosaurs occupied a different ecological niche than their parents, small enough to be targeted by predators that could not threaten adults, limited in their mobility and behavioral repertoire relative to mature individuals, and dependent on finding sufficient food to fuel the rapid growth their survival required. The mortality rate among juveniles was undoubtedly high, and the reproductive strategies of their parents were shaped in part by the expectation of these losses. The interplay between reproductive investment, juvenile vulnerability, and the broader predatory environment created a population dynamic that reflected the intense pressures of the ecosystem. High rates of juvenile mortality required high rates of reproduction to maintain stable populations, and the energy demands of reproduction competed with the energy demands of survival in an environment that did not guarantee consistent access to resources. These competing demands shaped the life history strategies of every species in the ecosystem, creating a web of trade-offs that influenced how each organism allocated its energy and time across the different demands of its existence. Within all of these layers of ecological complexity, a fundamental question begins to emerge. Why here? Why did ancient Australia produce an ecosystem that so thoroughly inverted the patterns seen everywhere else? Why was this the place where the apex predators were not the largest animals in the predator guild, where evolution took directions that no other continent matched, where the rules that seemed to govern the rest of the Cretaceous world simply did not apply? The answer, as we have been assembling it through this first part of our exploration, lies in the convergence of multiple unusual factors, each significant on its own, but together creating a compound effect that exceeded what any single factor could have produced. The southern latitude and its seasonal darkness, the progressive separation from Gondwana and the isolation it imposed, the inland seas and the habitat fragmentation they created. The particular combination of these forces, applied consistently across millions of years, created conditions that selected for biological solutions quite different from those that prevailed where these pressures were absent or less intense. Isolation was perhaps the most powerful single factor in this compound. When a landmass becomes separated from the broader biological community of the planet, the organisms it contains can no longer be supplemented, replaced, or influenced by species from elsewhere. Whatever was present at the time of separation becomes the raw material from which all subsequent biological development must emerge, shaped by local conditions without the moderating influence of exchange with the outside world. If those local conditions are unusual, and in ancient Australia they were profoundly unusual, the results of evolution operating within them can diverge dramatically from what occurs where no such isolation exists. The groups of animals that found themselves on this separating landmass carried particular combinations of traits that had already been shaped by the southern conditions prevailing before the separation became complete. These pre-existing traits, combined with the intensifying isolation and the specific pressures of the fragmenting, flooding, darkening environment, provided the starting material from which ancient Australia's unique ecological character was constructed. The inverted predator hierarchy, the unusual body forms, the distinctive behavioral strategies, all emerged from this combination of inherited characteristics meeting exceptional local conditions over an enormous span of time. Understanding this process requires holding in mind simultaneously both the broad sweep of geological and evolutionary time and the immediate, moment-to-moment pressures faced by individual organisms living within this world. The grand patterns were assembled from countless small decisions and outcomes, from the positioning of a predator along a river margin, from the routing choice of a herbivore group navigating between food patches and water sources, from the nesting location selected by apparent balancing exposure against accessibility. Each of these small-scale events contributed, across the accumulation of generations, to the large-scale patterns we can now observe through the lens of paleontology. This is the world we have been assembling in this first part of our exploration. A world of flooding seas and seasonal darkness, of fragmented habitats and intense competition, of inverted hierarchies and extraordinary adaptations, all produced by the convergence of geographical, geological, and evolutionary forces that combined in a way found nowhere else on the ancient Earth. In the second part of our exploration, we will go deeper into the specific creatures that inhabited this world, into the details of how they moved and hunted and competed and survived, and into what eventually happened to this extraordinary ecosystem as the forces that created it began to shift and the ancient Australian world began its long transformation towards something that no longer followed the same rules that had made it so remarkable. The evidence is there, preserved in stone across the southern continent, waiting in layers of ancient sediment for the questions that will allow it to speak. And the story it tells, when those questions are asked carefully and the answers assembled with patience, is one of the most remarkable chapters in the entire history of life on Earth. A chapter written in a place of darkness and flooding and isolation, where evolution discovered that the rules were not as fixed as they appeared, and where life found ways to persist, adapt, and ultimately thrive under conditions that should by any conventional measure have made thriving impossible. The world that had been building across millions of years of separation, flooding, and seasonal darkness did not pause to allow its inhabitants a moment of reflection. It pressed forward with the same steady insistence that had defined it from the beginning, shaping every organism that moved across its surface through forces that never fully relented. What emerged from this environment was not simply a collection of unusual animals occupying familiar roles in unfamiliar settings. It was an entirely different expression of how life could organize itself when the conditions demanded something new, something that the rest of the planet had never been required to produce. To understand what made the creatures of ancient Australia so distinctive, it is necessary to look beyond their individual characteristics and examine how they functioned within the specific context of this landscape. Every adaptation, every behavioral strategy, every physical feature carried meaning that could only be fully appreciated when viewed against the backdrop of the environment that had produced it. These were not animals that happened to live in an unusual place. They were animals that had been fundamentally shaped by that place, their biology reflecting millions of years of continuous dialogue between organism and environment. The herbivores that moved across this ancient terrain carried within their bodies the accumulated evidence of generations spent navigating a world where food was never guaranteed, and where the act of feeding itself carried consequences that extended well beyond simple nutrition. Their forms reflected the specific demands of the vegetation they consumed, the distances they needed to travel between productive areas, and the defensive requirements imposed by a predatory community that operated with unusual intensity and complexity. Among the most significant herbivores in this ecosystem were the ornithopod dinosaurs, a group that had achieved considerable diversity and ecological importance across much of the Cretaceous world, but that expressed particularly distinctive forms within the Australian context. These animals walked primarily on their hind legs, though some species could shift to all fours when feeding or moving slowly, and their jaws were equipped with batteries of tightly packed teeth that functioned as efficient grinding surfaces for processing the tough, fibrous vegetation that dominated the landscape. The dental batteries of these ornithopods represented one of the most sophisticated feeding mechanisms in the dinosaur world. Rows of teeth were arranged in columns that wore down continuously through use, with new teeth growing from below to replace those that had been ground away at the surface. This system ensured that the animal always had fresh, effective grinding surfaces available, an adaptation of particular value in an environment where the available vegetation was often tough, chemically defended, or nutritionally poor. The ability to efficiently extract nutrients from difficult plant material was not a luxury in this landscape. It was a fundamental requirement for survival. The bodies of these herbivores reflected the specific physical demands of their environment in other ways as well. Their hind limbs were proportioned for sustained travel rather than explosive speed, suggesting animals that covered considerable distances at moderate pace rather than relying on brief bursts of acceleration to escape danger. This endurance-oriented locomotion made sense within a landscape where food resources were unevenly distributed and where the distance between productive feeding areas could be substantial. An animal that needed to move regularly between separated habitat patches required a body built for efficiency over distance rather than for maximum velocity over short intervals. Their sensory capabilities, as inferred from the structure of their skulls and the spaces within them that housed the brain and sensory organs, suggest animals with well-developed hearing and a sophisticated sense of smell. These senses would have been particularly valuable in an environment where visual detection of threats could be unreliable, whether due to dense vegetation, the prolonged periods of reduced light associated with the polar seasons, or the simple fact that many of the most dangerous predators in this system were adapted for close approach and concealment rather than open pursuit. The social behavior of these ornithopods appears to have been a central component of their survival strategy. Evidence from trackways, bone beds containing remains of multiple individuals, and the broader ecological context all point toward animals that moved and fed in groups of varying size. These groups provided the benefits of shared vigilance, dilution of individual predatory risk, and collective knowledge of the landscape, advantages that would have been particularly significant in an environment where threats came from multiple directions and where the terrain itself could limit the effectiveness of individual alertness. Within these groups, the behavior of individuals reflected a constant negotiation between the competing demands of feeding, movement, and threat monitoring. Animals at the edges of the group bore a disproportionate share of the predatory risk, their exposed positions making them more likely to be the first point of contact with an approaching predator. Animals toward the center gained protection from this arrangement, but might have reduced access to the best feeding opportunities if the outer individuals were consuming the most accessible vegetation. These trade-offs created a dynamic internal structure where position within the group was not fixed but shifted in response to changing conditions, individual needs, and the relative costs and benefits of different locations. The movement of these herbivore groups across the landscape was not random or purely reactive. It followed patterns shaped by experience, guided by knowledge of where productive feeding areas existed, where water could be accessed, and where the terrain offered advantages in terms of predator detection or escape. Older, more experienced individuals within a group likely carried this environmental knowledge and influenced the direction and timing of group movements, their accumulated experience representing a form of information that benefited the entire collective. These movement patterns created predictable flows across the landscape that predators could learn to anticipate. The routes that herbivore groups followed between feeding areas, water sources, and resting locations became the framework within which predatory behavior organized itself. A predator that understood these patterns could position itself along a likely route and wait for its prey to approach, converting knowledge of herbivore behavior into hunting advantage without the energy cost of active search and pursuit. The vulnerability of these herbivore groups varied significantly depending on the terrain they were moving through. In open areas where visibility extended in all directions, the collective vigilance of the group provided relatively effective early warning of approaching threats. In more confined spaces, where vegetation or terrain features limited sightlines, that advantage was reduced and the conditions shifted in favor of predators that could approach through cover. The transitions between these different terrain types represented points of particular danger, moments when the group's defensive capabilities changed and where the balance of advantage could shift from prey to predator. Water crossings represented an extreme version of this vulnerability. When herbivore groups needed to cross waterways, whether rivers, streams, or the margins of the inland seas, the act of entering and moving through water disrupted the group's spatial organization, reduced the mobility of individual animals, and simultaneously exposed them to aquatic predators that might be present in the water itself. The convergence of reduced terrestrial mobility and potential aquatic threat at these crossing points made them among the most dangerous locations in the landscape, and the predictability of their use by herbivore groups made them attractive locations for predators of all types. The seasonal dimensions of herbivore behavior added another layer of complexity. During periods of extended daylight, when plant growth was at its peak and food resources were most abundant, herbivore groups could range more widely and feed more effectively, building energy reserves that would be needed during the leaner months ahead. As the light diminished toward the polar winter, plant productivity declined, and herbivores faced increasing pressure to locate sufficient food within a landscape that was becoming less productive. This seasonal cycle created periods of relative ease and periods of genuine stress, and the transition between them required behavioral adjustments that affected every aspect of daily life. During the periods of reduced light, the behavior of herbivore groups likely changed in ways that reflected the altered conditions. Movement might have been reduced to conserve energy during a time when food intake was constrained. Group cohesion might have tightened as the reduced visibility of the darker months made shared vigilance more valuable. Feeding patterns might have shifted toward less nutritious, but more consistently available food sources that could sustain the animals through the line period, even if they did not provide optimal nutrition. These seasonal adjustments created corresponding changes in predatory behavior. Predators that relied on visual detection of prey needed to adapt their hunting strategies to conditions of reduced light. Those that depended on ambush tactics might have found the darker months more conducive to their approach, while pursuit predators might have been disadvantaged by the reduced visibility. The seasonal cycle thus influenced not just the productivity of the ecosystem, but the relative effectiveness of different predatory strategies, potentially shifting the balance of advantage between different predator species as the light conditions changed. The interplay between herbivore behavior, seasonal conditions, and predatory strategy created a system of remarkable complexity, one where the interactions between species were continuously modulated by environmental factors that were themselves in constant flux. Understanding any single element of this system in isolation would provide only a partial picture. The full richness of ancient Australian ecology emerged from the intersection of all these factors, operating simultaneously and influencing one another through feedback loops that extended across the entire ecosystem. The predators that occupied the upper levels of the ancient Australian food chain were themselves products of the same unusual conditions that had shaped everything else in this environment. Their bodies, their behaviors, and their ecological relationships all reflected the specific pressures of a landscape that demanded something different from its apex hunters than what was required elsewhere in the Cretaceous world. The Megaraptorans, the group that appears to have occupied the apex predator position in this ecosystem, represent one of the most intriguing predatory lineages in the entire dinosaur record. These animals combined features that might seem contradictory in a single predator, possessing both the powerful, grasping forelimbs associated with close contact hunting and the relatively gracile build and long legs associated with more active pursuit. The integration of these features into a single body plan suggests a predator of considerable versatility, one capable of adapting its hunting approach to different prey types, different terrain conditions, and different situations. The forelimbs of Megaraptorans were equipped with large, strongly curved claws that were among the most impressive predatory weapons in the dinosaur world. These were not the relatively small, manipulative hands seen in many large theropods. They were powerful, robust structures supported by muscular arms and designed to deliver significant force through hooking and pulling motions. The curvature of the claws and the orientation of the muscle attachment sites on the arm bones indicate that these limbs were used to grasp and restrain, pulling prey toward the predator's body with a force that would have been extremely difficult for a captured animal to resist. This grappling approach to predation represented a fundamentally different strategy from the bite-dominated hunting of the larger carcharodontosaurids or tyrannosaurs, where those predators relied primarily on the force of their jaws to subdue prey, delivering devastating bites that could crush bone and sever major anatomical structures. Megaraptorans appear to have used their forelimbs as the primary offensive weapons, with the jaws serving a secondary role in finishing the engagement. This division of function between limbs and jaws allowed for a more sustained and controlled predatory interaction, one where the prey was secured through physical grip before being dispatched. The advantages of this approach within the specific environment of ancient Australia become clearer when the landscape and conditions are taken into account. In dense vegetation, where the open pursuit and bite-strike strategies of larger theropods might have been less effective, a predator that could close to short range through cover and then secure its prey through direct physical contact had a significant tactical advantage. The curved claws and powerful arms of Megaraptorans allowed them to maintain hold on prey that was struggling within vegetation or on uneven terrain, situations where a predator relying solely on jaw-based attacks might lose contact with its target. The lower body of Megaraptorans supported this close-contact predatory style with features designed for stability and sustained force application. Their legs were proportioned for a combination of speed and power, allowing them to close distance quickly when an opportunity presented itself, and then provide a stable platform for the physical engagement that followed. The feet were equipped with well-developed claws that could grip the ground during the forces involved in restraining struggling prey, preventing the predator from being pulled off balance during the engagement. This combination of features created an animal that was extraordinarily well-suited to the conditions of ancient Australia. Its versatility allowed it to hunt effectively in a range of environments, from the more open areas between vegetation patches to the denser growth along waterways and in the fragmented habitats created by the inland seas. Its close contact hunting strategy was particularly effective in the confined spaces that characterized much of this landscape, where the room for open pursuit was often limited, and where the ability to secure prey quickly and maintain that hold through physical engagement provided a decisive advantage. The carcharodontosaurids that coexisted with Megaraptorans in Australia appear to have been smaller than their relatives on other continents, occupying a subordinate position within the predatory hierarchy rather than the dominant role they held elsewhere. This reversal of the usual size and dominance relationship between these two groups is one of the most distinctive features of the ancient Australian ecosystem, and one of the strongest indicators that the conditions here were fundamentally different from those prevailing across the rest of the Cretaceous world. Several factors may have contributed to the reduced size and subordinate status of Australian carcharodontosaurids. The fragmented habitat with its limited open spaces may have reduced the advantages of the very large body size that these animals achieved elsewhere. Their bite-dominated hunting strategy, while effective against large prey in open environments, may have been less well suited to the constrained conditions of the Australian landscape. The presence of already established Megaraptorans that were better adapted to local conditions may have limited the ecological space available to carcharodontosaurids, constraining their ability to achieve the sizes and ecological dominance that characterized their relatives on other continents. The competitive dynamics between these two predator groups would have been a significant feature of the ecological landscape. Both were large enough to represent threats to each other in certain circumstances, and their overlapping prey preferences would have brought them into regular competitive contact. The patterns of interaction between them, whether expressed as direct physical conflict, avoidance of one another, or partitioning of the landscape to reduce encounters, would have shaped the distribution and behavior of both groups across the available habitat. Evidence of predator-on-predator interaction in the Australian fossil record suggests that these encounters were not always resolved through avoidance alone. Bite marks on the bones of large predators, including marks that suggest teeth of other large predatory species, indicate that physical confrontation between different predator types occurred with some regularity. The injuries recorded in these fossil bones range from minor scrapes to significant penetrating wounds, and the presence of healed injuries indicates that many of these confrontations did not end fatally for the animal that bore the marks. The recovery from such injuries in an environment without medical intervention tells a story of remarkable biological resilience. An animal that survived a significant wound from another predator, then healed sufficiently to continue hunting, feeding, and potentially reproducing, demonstrated a capacity for recovery that reflected both the robustness of dinosaurian biology and the strength of selective pressure, favoring individuals capable of surviving conflict. In an environment where encounters between predators were a regular feature of life, the ability to survive such encounters without fatal consequence was a trait of considerable survival value. The behavioral strategies that predators used to manage their interactions with one another were likely as complex and nuanced as those they employed in hunting prey. Territorial behavior, in which individuals or groups maintained preferential access to specific areas of the landscape, would have reduced the frequency of direct encounters between established predators. Displays of size, posture, and perhaps vocalization could have communicated intent and capability without requiring physical contact, allowing disputes to be resolved through assessment rather than combat in many cases. When these less costly methods of dispute resolution failed, the physical encounters that followed were shaped by the anatomy and capabilities of the animals involved. A confrontation between two Megaraptorans would have been a very different event from one between a Megaraptoran and a carcharodontosaurid. The weapons available, the tactical approaches each animal could employ, and the relative risks faced by each participant all varied depending on the specific combination of species and individuals involved. These encounters were not scripted battles but dynamic interactions whose outcomes depended on a complex interplay of size, condition, motivation, terrain, and chance. Beyond the largest carnivorous dinosaurs, the predatory community of ancient Australia included a diverse array of smaller hunters that occupied ecological niches inaccessible to the apex predators. These smaller carnivores ranged from mid-sized theropods capable of taking prey of moderate size to very small species that targeted insects, small vertebrates, and other diminutive organisms. Their presence added considerable depth to the predatory structure of the ecosystem, creating a layered hierarchy where different sizes of predator partitioned the available prey among themselves. Among the most notable of these smaller predators were various dromaeosaurid and troodontid dinosaurs, groups that combined relatively small body size with sophisticated sensory capabilities and potential pack hunting behavior. These animals possessed enlarged claws on their hind feet, a hallmark of their lineage, which served as weapons during predatory encounters, and their brain-to-body size ratios were among the highest in the dinosaur world, suggesting cognitive capabilities that exceeded those of many of their larger relatives. In the conditions of ancient Australia, the sophisticated sensory capabilities of these smaller predators would have been particularly valuable. Their large eyes, possibly adapted for low-light conditions, would have given them an advantage during the extended periods of reduced illumination that characterized the polar seasons. Their potentially enhanced hearing and smell would have allowed them to detect prey and threats in conditions where visual information was limited. These advantages may have made them particularly effective predators during the darker months, when the reduced light conditions that challenged many other species could have represented an opportunity for animals adapted to function effectively in dimness. The potential for coordinated group hunting among these smaller predators added another dimension to their ecological role. While the evidence for true cooperative hunting in dinosaurs remains debated, the association of multiple individuals of the same species at fossil sites, combined with the biomechanical limitations that individual small predators would face against larger prey, suggests that some form of coordinated behavior may have occurred. If these animals were capable of hunting together, even in a loosely organized fashion, they would have been able to target prey significantly larger than any individual could manage alone, expanding their ecological niche considerably. The relationship between these smaller predators and the larger carnivores above them in the hierarchy was not simply one of avoidance. While the smaller animals certainly needed to manage the risk posed by larger predators, they also benefited from the activities of the larger carnivores in various ways. Carcasses left by larger predators represented feeding opportunities for smaller scavengers, and the territorial behavior of larger predators could create boundaries within the landscape that indirectly benefited smaller species by providing some degree of structure to the distribution of threats. Conversely, the smaller predators could represent a nuisance or even a genuine threat to larger carnivores under certain circumstances. A group of smaller predators harassing a larger animal at a carcass could potentially displace it, particularly if the larger animal was already weakened by injury or illness. The eggs and young of larger predators were potential targets for the smaller species, and the investment that larger predators made in reproduction could be undermined by the activities of smaller animals that were difficult to guard against continuously. These interactions between different levels of the predatory hierarchy created a complex web of relationships where the actions of each participant influenced the options available to every other. The ecosystem did not function as a simple chain of predator and prey, but as a network of interconnected relationships that operated across multiple scales of size, space, and time. The crocodilian relatives that inhabited ancient Australia deserve particular attention for the ways in which they expanded the predatory landscape beyond the boundaries that might be expected from their modern descendants. The crocodilomorphs of the Cretaceous period were a far more diverse group than their living representatives suggest, including forms that had adapted to fully terrestrial lifestyles with limb proportions and locomotor capabilities that would seem remarkable to anyone familiar only with modern crocodiles. Some of these ancient crocodilian relatives carried their bodies high off the ground on legs positioned more directly beneath their torsos than the splayed limbs of modern crocodilians. This upright posture allowed them to move across land with a speed and efficiency that far exceeded what any living crocodile can achieve, turning them into active terrestrial predators capable of pursuing prey across open ground. Their skulls, while retaining the basic crocodilian architecture, were modified in ways that reflected their terrestrial hunting lifestyle, with features adapted for capturing and processing prey encountered on land rather than in water. Others retained more aquatic habits but achieved sizes and developed anatomical features that made them formidable threats to terrestrial animals approaching waterways. These forms lurked in the rivers, lakes, and margins of the inland seas, their ability to remain submerged and motionless for extended periods making them nearly undetectable until they struck. The transition from apparent stillness to explosive movement was one of the most dangerous moments any terrestrial animal could encounter in this landscape, a sudden transformation of the water's edge from a place of refreshment to a place of lethal danger. The diversity of crocodilomorph body plans present in Cretaceous Australia meant that these animals collectively occupied a broader range of ecological roles than any single group might suggest. From fully terrestrial runners to semi-aquatic ambush predators, from small species targeting modest prey to large forms capable of threatening animals of substantial size, the crocodilomorphs represented a pervasive presence across the landscape that added to the already considerable predatory pressure experienced by every other inhabitant. The ecological significance of this crocodilomorph diversity extended beyond simple predation. As one of the groups with the greatest range of habitat use, spanning both aquatic and terrestrial environments, crocodilomorphs served as biological links between these two worlds. Nutrients consumed in one environment were transported to another through the movements of these animals, and their activities along the boundaries between land and water influenced the structure and dynamics of both terrestrial and aquatic communities. Their presence also influenced the behavior of other animals in ways that extended well beyond direct predatory encounters. The risk associated with approaching water, already significant due to the presence of aquatic predators, was compounded by the possibility that terrestrial crocodilomorphs might also be present near waterways, hunting from the land side of the boundary. This created a zone of compound danger around every water feature in the landscape, a band of elevated risk that animals needed to cross when approaching water, but could not avoid if they needed to drink, bathe, or cross to reach resources on the other side. When the light finally failed for extended periods during the polar winter, the entire ecosystem shifted into a mode of operation that had no parallel in the warmer regions of the Cretaceous world. The prolonged darkness that settled over this southern landscape was not total blackness, but rather an extended twilight that reduced visibility, lowered temperatures, and fundamentally altered the conditions under which every organism had to function. This was not a brief seasonal inconvenience, but a defining feature of life at these latitudes, a period that could last for weeks or months depending on the exact position and the precise timing within the broader seasonal cycle. For plants, the reduced light of the polar winter meant a dramatic slowdown in photosynthetic activity. Many species likely entered a dormant or semi-dormant state, ceasing active growth and relying on stored reserves to maintain their basic biological functions until the return of adequate light. Deciduous species, those that shed their leaves during unfavorable conditions, may have stripped their canopies during this period, reducing the energetic cost of maintaining photosynthetic tissue that could not function effectively in the available light. This reduction in plant activity cascaded upward through the ecosystem with immediate and significant effects. Herbivores that depended on actively growing vegetation for their primary food source found that supply drastically reduced during the darkest months. The quality of remaining vegetation likely declined as well, as plants in dormant or stressed states provide less nutritional value than those in active growth. This nutritional stress placed herbivore populations under pressure that was separate from but compounded by the predatory risks they faced. For the herbivores, surviving the polar winter required strategies that could accommodate weeks of reduced food availability while maintaining the energy reserves needed to sustain body functions, avoid predators, and remain capable of rapid response to threats. Some species may have entered a state of reduced metabolic activity during the darkest periods, lowering their energy requirements to match the reduced intake. Others may have relied on stored fat reserves accumulated during the productive summer months, burning these reserves through the lean winter period and then rebuilding them when conditions improved. Migration offered another potential strategy for dealing with seasonal extremity. Some herbivore populations may have moved to lower latitudes during the darkest months, traveling toward regions where light conditions remained more favorable and where vegetation continued to provide adequate nutrition. Such migrations would have required the ability to navigate across significant distances, to maintain group cohesion during travel, and to compete for resources in regions that might already be occupied by resident populations. The fossil record has not yet provided definitive evidence for or against long-distance seasonal migration in Australian Cretaceous herbivores, but the possibility remains an active area of investigation. Predators faced their own set of challenges during the polar winter. Those that relied heavily on visual detection of prey found their primary hunting sense compromised by the reduced light. This might have shifted the balance of advantage toward predators with enhanced non-visual senses, such as acute hearing or smell, potentially changing the relative success rates of different predator species during different seasons. Predators that could hunt effectively in low-light conditions, including those smaller theropods with potentially enhanced night vision, might have experienced a period of relative competitive advantage during the darkest months. The reduced activity levels of both predators and prey during the polar winter did not mean that all interactions ceased. Hungry predators still needed to eat, and weakened herbivores were potentially more vulnerable during this period. The combination of reduced prey alertness and reduced predator efficiency in the darkness created a different dynamic from the summer months, one where encounters might be less frequent, but where the outcomes of those encounters could be more consequential for animals already stressed by reduced food availability and sustained cold. Temperature, while not reaching the extremes of a modern polar winter thanks to the global warmth of the Cretaceous period, still dropped significantly during the period of reduced sunlight. The absence of direct solar warming, combined with the thermal properties of the atmosphere, meant that the landscape cooled noticeably during the darkest months. This cooling affected the metabolic rates of ectothermic animals, potentially slowing the activity of reptilian predators and prey alike. Endothermic or partially endothermic animals, those that generated internal heat, would have had an advantage during these cooler periods, maintaining their activity levels while cold-blooded competitors became less effective. The question of thermoregulation in Cretaceous dinosaurs is one of the most actively researched areas of paleontology, and the Australian polar dinosaurs provide some of the most compelling evidence in this debate. The ability of dinosaurs to live and apparently thrive at high southern latitudes experiencing extended periods of darkness and cool temperatures, strongly suggests that at least some of these species possessed metabolic capabilities that exceeded those of modern reptiles. Whether this took the form of full endothermy, partial endothermy, or some intermediate metabolic strategy remains a subject of scientific discussion, but the simple fact of their survival in these conditions constrains the range of possible physiological interpretations. The polar winter was not merely a period of hardship to be endured. It was a selective filter that shaped the evolution of every species that lived through it. Animals that could manage the combined stresses of reduced food, reduced light, and reduced temperature passed their traits to subsequent generations, while those that could not were removed from the population. Over millions of years, this seasonal filtering refined the organisms of this landscape, producing species that carried within their biology the accumulated solutions to problems that organisms in more equatorial environments never needed to solve. The margins of the inland seas that spread across ancient Australia were not simple boundaries between land and water. They were complex transition zones where multiple ecosystems converged, creating environments of extraordinary ecological richness and equally extraordinary danger. Understanding these margins is essential to understanding how the broader ecosystem functioned, because so many of the critical interactions that shaped the system occurred along these shifting edges. The shallow waters near the shore supported communities of organisms that had adapted to the specific conditions of this environment. Invertebrates populated the sediment and the water column, creating food webs that supported fish, which in turn supported the larger marine reptiles that moved through the inland seas. Along the very edge, where the water was shallowest and the boundary between aquatic and terrestrial environments was most blurred, organisms from both worlds could encounter each other directly. Terrestrial animals approached these margins out of necessity rather than choice. Water was essential for survival, and in a landscape where rainfall was not always reliable, the inland seas and the waterways that fed them represented the most consistent sources of fresh or brackish water available. Herbivores needed to drink regularly, particularly during periods of active feeding and movement, and the requirement to approach water drew them toward precisely the locations where both terrestrial and aquatic predators were most likely to be concentrated. The dynamics of these approaches reflected the accumulated experience of generations of animals that had learned, through hard selection, to treat the water's edge with extreme caution. Groups approached together rather than as individuals, maintaining the collective vigilance that provided their primary defense against surprise attack. The approach was typically gradual, with frequent pauses to assess the surroundings before moving closer. Animals at the front of the group bore the greatest immediate risk, but also had the first access to the water, creating a trade-off that might have been influenced by the animal's current level of need relative to its assessment of the danger. Once at the water's edge, the time spent drinking was minimized. Animals drank quickly and withdrew, reducing the duration of their exposure at the most dangerous point in the landscape. This efficiency came at a potential nutritional cost, as time spent at the water's edge could also have been used for feeding on the often lush vegetation that grew near water sources, but the risk calculus apparently favored rapid departure over extended feeding in many circumstances. Marine predators positioned near these shorelines had adapted their own strategies to exploit the predictable arrival of terrestrial prey. The ability to remain submerged and motionless, detecting the approach of animals through vibrations transmitted through the water, allowed aquatic predators to position themselves without revealing their presence until the final moment. The explosive acceleration from stillness to attack, a characteristic of ambush predators in both aquatic and terrestrial environments, was particularly effective in water, where the resistance of the medium concealed the buildup of movement until it erupted through the surface. The intersection of aquatic and terrestrial predatory systems at the water's edge created moments of extraordinary intensity. A terrestrial herbivore approached by a group of smaller terrestrial predators might flee toward water, only to encounter a greater threat from that direction. A terrestrial predator pursuing prey along a shoreline might find itself in competition with an aquatic predator emerging from the water to claim the same target. These multi-dimensional encounters, where threats could materialize from land, water, or air simultaneously, represented the most complex and dangerous situations in the entire ecosystem. Carcasses that came to rest near the water's edge attracted particular concentrations of competing scavengers. The remains of a large animal near the shore could draw terrestrial predators from inland, aquatic predators from the water, aerial scavengers from above, and smaller opportunistic feeders from all directions. The resulting gathering could include species from multiple ecosystems, all competing for access to the same limited resource in a confined and dangerous space. These gatherings represented moments of maximum ecological intensity, where the full complexity of the predatory web was expressed in its most concentrated form. The processes by which dead organisms were broken down and returned to the ecosystem reveal important aspects of how this world functioned at a fundamental level. Scavenging was not a minor or incidental activity in ancient Australia. It was a significant ecological process that involved a substantial proportion of the predatory community and that played a critical role in the cycling of nutrients and energy through the system. The efficiency with which carcasses were processed in this environment reflected the intensity of competition for resources. In a landscape where food availability was variable and often limited, the appearance of a large carcass represented a significant nutritional opportunity that could not be allowed to go unused. Multiple species converged on these resources, each employing different strategies to secure access and extract value before the opportunity was lost. Larger predators typically had first access to fresh carcasses, their size and strength allowing them to dominate the immediate area around the remains. But even these dominant scavengers could not consume an entire large carcass quickly, and the time they spent feeding allowed other species to gather nearby, waiting for opportunities to approach. When the primary feeders withdrew, whether because they were satiated, disturbed, or attracted elsewhere, these secondary scavengers moved in, targeting the portions that remained accessible. The sequence of scavenging typically followed a pattern determined by anatomy. The soft tissues, muscles, organs, and fat were consumed first, being the most accessible and nutritionally valuable. As these were removed, the harder structures, tendons, cartilage, and ultimately bone, became the focus of attention for species capable of processing them. Some predators possessed jaw structures capable of cracking bone to access the marrow within, a nutritionally rich resource that was unavailable to species with less powerful dental and cranial architecture. The marks left on bones during this process provide some of the most detailed evidence available about the ecological interactions of this world. Tooth marks of different sizes and shapes, left by different species at different stages of the scavenging process, create a layered record that can be read by careful analysis. The depth, width, and spacing of these marks indicate the size and jaw mechanics of the animal that made them, while their position on the bone and their relationship to other marks reveal something about the sequence and intensity of feeding. In some cases, the marks on a single bone tell a story of multiple feeding events, with marks from different species overlapping and intersecting in ways that indicate either simultaneous or sequential access by a range of scavengers. These composite records capture the full complexity of the scavenging process, showing how a single resource was partitioned among multiple consumers through a combination of competitive displacement, temporal separation, and anatomical specialization. The efficiency of this scavenging process meant that very little organic material was wasted in this ecosystem. The nutrients and energy contained in every animal that died were rapidly redistributed through the food web, supporting the survival of organisms that might not otherwise have found sufficient resources. In an environment where productivity was constrained by seasonal light limitations and where habitat fragmentation restricted the total area of usable land, this efficiency was not a minor ecological detail. It was a significant factor in maintaining the viability of populations at all trophic levels. The physical evidence preserved in fossilized bone extends far beyond the marks left by teeth. The bones themselves carry records of growth, injury, disease, and the broader conditions under which the animals lived. Reading these records requires a combination of careful observation, comparative analysis, and an understanding of how living bone responds to the forces applied to it during an animal's lifetime. Growth patterns preserved within fossil bone, visible through thin section analysis under microscopic examination, reveal the rate at which different species added mass during their development. The structure of bone tissue varies depending on how quickly it was deposited, with rapidly growing bone showing a distinct and recognizable organization that differs from bone deposited during slower growth. By examining these patterns across a bone's cross-section, paleontologists can reconstruct the growth trajectory of the animal, identifying periods of rapid growth, intervals of slower development, and the eventual attainment of adult size. In many Australian Cretaceous dinosaurs, these growth records indicate fast growth rates, particularly during the juvenile period. This rapid growth would have been advantageous in an environment with intense predatory pressure, as it reduced the duration of the most vulnerable phase of life when the animal's small size made it accessible to a wide range of predators. The evolutionary premium on rapid juvenile growth in this high-pressure environment would have been substantial, and the bone histology of these animals reflects that selective pressure directly. Pathological features on fossil bones provide evidence of the health challenges faced by animals in this ecosystem. Infections, tumors, stress fractures, and other conditions left marks on bone that can be identified and interpreted by paleopathologists. The prevalence of certain types of pathology in a fossil assemblage can reveal information about the general health conditions experienced by the populations represented, including nutritional stress, repeated physical trauma, and infectious disease. Stress fractures, which result from repetitive mechanical loading beyond the bone's tolerance, appear in the remains of animals that engaged in sustained physical activity that pushed their skeletal structures to their limits. In large predators, such injuries might reflect the physical demands of hunting, particularly the forces involved in restraining struggling prey. In herbivores, they might indicate the cumulative effects of long-distance travel across uneven terrain or the stress of flight from predatory pursuit. Evidence of nutritional stress, preserved in the form of growth interruption lines within bone, provides a biological record of periods when food availability was insufficient to maintain normal growth. These lines of arrested growth, similar to the rings visible in tree trunks, mark intervals when the organism's energy budget was so constrained that skeletal growth was temporarily halted. The number and spacing of these lines within a bone cross-section reveal the frequency and duration of stress episodes experienced during the animal's life, providing a biological diary of its nutritional history. In the Australian Cretaceous context, these growth interruption lines are particularly informative. Their presence, potentially corresponding to the lean months of the polar winter when plant productivity declined, would provide direct biological evidence of the seasonal stress that the light regime imposed on herbivore populations. Multiple closely spaced growth arrest lines in a single bone would indicate an animal that experienced repeated seasonal stress, surviving through multiple difficult periods, but bearing the biological evidence of each one within its skeleton. The combination of fast growth rates during favorable periods and growth arrest during unfavorable ones creates a distinctive pattern that reflects the boom and bust dynamics of life at high southern latitudes. This pattern, visible directly in the structure of fossilized bone, connects the large-scale environmental conditions of the ancient landscape to the intimate biological reality of individual organisms living within it, providing a bridge between the geological and paleontological scales of observation. The deep geological processes that had set this world in motion continued throughout the Cretaceous period, gradually altering the conditions under which life had organized itself. The drift of the Australian plate away from Antarctica progressed steadily, incrementally increasing the water gap between the two landmasses and deepening the isolation that had already begun to shape the biological character of the continent. Ocean currents that had been blocked or redirected by the connection between the two landmasses began to establish new patterns as the gap widened, carrying thermal signatures across different latitudes and influencing climate patterns in ways that accumulated over millions of years. These changes did not occur quickly enough to be apparent within any single generation of organisms, but they were relentless, altering the fundamental parameters of the environment through tiny increments that accumulated into significant differences over the time scales relevant to evolution. The climate, while remaining warm by modern standards, underwent gradual modifications as the circulation of ocean water and atmospheric currents responded to the changing configuration of the continents. Some of these modifications made conditions slightly more moderate, potentially reducing the severity of the seasonal extremes that had been such a powerful selective force. Others introduced new complications, changing rainfall patterns that had been relatively stable, altering the distribution of productive habitats, or creating new oceanographic conditions that influenced the inland seas in unpredictable ways. These slow environmental shifts required continuous adaptive responses from the organisms living within them, adding another layer of pressure to the already considerable demands of the ecosystem. The inland seas themselves responded to these geological and climatic changes, their extent and distribution varying over timescales of millions of years as the balance between global sea level, regional subsidence, and sediment supply shifted. During some intervals, the seas expanded significantly, fragmenting the continental interior into a complex archipelago of islands and peninsulas surrounded by warm, shallow water. During others, they contracted, exposing previously submerged terrain and reconnecting habitat patches that had been separated by water. Each cycle of expansion and contraction reorganized the distribution of terrestrial habitat, disrupting established populations, creating new opportunities, and imposing fresh selective pressures on every species affected. The organisms that thrived in this environment were not those adapted to any single configuration of land and sea, but those capable of adjusting to the transitions between configurations, maintaining viable populations through periods of fragmentation, and reassembling those populations when connectivity was restored. This capacity for adjustment was itself a product of the environment, shaped by millions of years of exposure to exactly these kinds of fluctuations. The species that survived in ancient Australia carried within their biology a tolerance for instability that had been refined through countless cycles of environmental change. This tolerance manifested in flexible behaviors, physiological adaptability, and population structures that could accommodate the gains and losses associated with fluctuating habitat availability. As the Cretaceous period continued to progress and the environmental conditions slowly evolved, the biological communities of Australia were drawn into new configurations that reflected the changing pressures. Some lineages that had been prominent during earlier phases of the Cretaceous began to shift in relative importance, their ecological roles expanding or contracting as conditions favored different combinations of traits. New forms appeared, sometimes through the gradual transformation of existing lineages, and sometimes through the establishment of populations that had not previously been significant components of the community. The appearance of new species within the Australian context was constrained by the same isolation that shaped everything else. Without the influx of species from other continents, the source of all new biological diversity was the modification of organisms already present. This internal generation of diversity followed pathways determined by the characteristics of the existing species and the pressures they experienced, creating outcomes that might diverge significantly from what was occurring elsewhere under different conditions. Some of these evolutionary outcomes involved the development of increasingly specialized adaptations to specific ecological opportunities. As the ecosystem matured and the interactions between species became more refined, the potential for organisms to develop close relationships with particular resources or habitats increased. Species that could exploit specific food sources more efficiently than their competitors gained advantages that might allow them to persist even as broader conditions changed, provided that their specific resources remained available. Others moved in the opposite direction, toward greater generalization and flexibility. In an environment characterized by instability and unpredictable change, the ability to exploit a broad range of resources and to function effectively across a variety of conditions could be more valuable than any specific specialization. Organisms that could shift their diet, alter their behavior, or occupy different habitats as conditions changed maintained options that more specialized species did not have, providing a different kind of insurance against environmental uncertainty. Both strategies carried risks. Specialists were vulnerable to the loss of their specific resources, which could occur through environmental change, competition, or simple chance. Generalists, while more flexible, might be outcompeted by specialists in any specific situation where the specialist's advantages were relevant. The balance between these approaches shifted continuously as conditions changed, and the relative success of specialized and generalized strategies at any given time depended on the specific mix of environmental conditions prevailing during that period. The interplay between specialization and generalization created a diversity of forms within the Australian ecosystem that reflected the full range of evolutionary responses to a complex and changing environment. This diversity was not infinite, constrained as it was by the limited pool of ancestral lineages available and by the specific conditions that shaped which adaptations were viable, but it was sufficient to create an ecological community of considerable complexity. The fossil record of ancient Australia, while rich in certain localities, remains incomplete in ways that continue to limit scientific understanding of this remarkable world. The geological processes that preserved some organisms and destroyed others were themselves selective, favoring the preservation of animals that died in or near environments conducive to fossilization, such as river channels, lake margins, and the shallow seas themselves, while leaving little record of organisms that lived and died in upland areas or other environments where the conditions for fossilization were less favorable. This preservational bias means that the picture we have of ancient Australian life is skewed toward organisms that occupied lowland and waterside habitats. Animals that lived in drier, more elevated environments or that avoided water margins are underrepresented in the fossil record, and our understanding of their diversity, abundance, and ecological roles is consequently limited. The full complexity of the ancient Australian ecosystem was almost certainly greater than what the current fossil record reveals, and each new discovery has the potential to expand the known diversity significantly. Despite these limitations, the discoveries that have been made paint a vivid picture of an ecosystem unlike any other in the Cretaceous world. The combination of unusual environmental conditions and prolonged isolation produced a biological community that challenges simple comparison with other continental faunas and that continues to yield surprises as new fossils are uncovered and analyzed. Each new site, each new specimen, adds detail to a picture that remains incomplete, but that grows more compelling with every addition. The techniques available for analyzing fossil material have expanded dramatically in recent years, allowing scientists to extract far more information from each specimen than was possible even a few decades ago. Advanced imaging technologies reveal internal structures without the need for destructive analysis. Chemical analyses of bone and tooth material provide information about diet, metabolism, and environmental conditions. Biomechanical modeling allows researchers to reconstruct how extinct animals moved, fed, and interacted based on the physical properties of their preserved remains. These modern analytical tools, applied to the fossil material from ancient Australia, are producing insights that are fundamentally reshaping understanding of this world. What was once known primarily through the external shapes of bones is now understood in terms of growth rates, physiological capabilities, dietary preferences, and behavioral repertoires. This deeper understanding reveals an ecosystem of far greater sophistication and complexity than earlier generations of paleontologists, working with more limited tools, were able to appreciate. The process of discovery continues. New fossil sites are identified, new expeditions are planned and executed, and new specimens emerge from the rock that has held them for more than 100 million years. Each of these discoveries represents a small window into a world that has been gone for an immense span of time, a world that existed under conditions no living person has experienced, but that left behind enough evidence to be reconstructed, partially but meaningfully, through the patient work of science. The eventual transformation of this ecosystem was not a sudden event, but a gradual progression that unfolded across millions of years, driven by the same forces that had created the system in the first place. The continuing drift of the continental plate, the slow evolution of global climate patterns, and the changing configuration of ocean currents all contributed to a progressive alteration of the conditions that had sustained the distinctive ecology of ancient Australia. As the continent moved further from Antarctica, the climate regime began to shift in ways that affected every level of the ecosystem. The seasonal extremes of the polar position gradually moderated as the landmass moved toward lower latitudes, reducing the intensity of the light cycle that had been such a powerful selective force. The extended periods of darkness that had shaped so many aspects of biology and behavior became less pronounced, and the ecosystem began to adjust to conditions where light was more evenly distributed across the year. The inland seas that had fragmented the continental interior began their own long retreat as global sea levels fluctuated, and the geological processes that had maintained the interior subsidence shifted. The withdrawal of these seas exposed vast areas of previously submerged terrain, creating new habitats and reconnecting areas that had been separated by water. This reconnection altered the patterns of isolation that had driven the divergence of populations, potentially allowing genetic exchange between groups that had been evolving independently for significant periods. These environmental transitions created opportunities for some lineages and challenges for others. Species that had been specifically adapted to the conditions of the fragmented, seasonally extreme landscape found those adaptations less advantageous as conditions changed. Traits that had provided survival advantages under intense competition in confined spaces might offer less benefit in a more expansive, more moderate environment. The selective pressures that had shaped these organisms shifted direction, favoring different combinations of traits than those that had been optimized under previous conditions. Some lineages responded to these changing conditions with further adaptation, modifying their characteristics to match the evolving environment. Others could not adjust quickly enough or in the right directions, finding themselves increasingly marginalized as the world they were adapted to transformed around them. The gradual decline of such lineages, expressed as reduced population sizes, contracted ranges, and eventually extinction, was a natural consequence of environmental change operating on organisms that had been shaped by different conditions. This process of biological turnover was not a catastrophe but a transition, a transformation of ecological structure in response to altered conditions. The species that emerged from this transition period were different from those that had preceded them, reflecting the new balance of environmental factors that governed survival. Some carried traces of the earlier world within their biology, inherited traits that had originated under the pressures of the polar Cretaceous, but that continued to provide benefits under the modified conditions. Others were more distinctly products of the new environment, shaped by forces that had not been present or significant during the earlier phase. The distinction between these two categories was not always clear. Evolution does not proceed in discrete phases with clean boundaries between them. Instead, it operates as a continuous process where older and newer influences coexist within the same organisms, blending contributions from different selective periods into integrated biological systems that reflect their full evolutionary history. The organisms that lived through the transition from the more extreme conditions of the polar Cretaceous to the more moderate conditions that followed carried within them elements of both worlds, creating forms that were neither purely old nor purely new, but syntheses of the full range of pressures that had shaped them over time. What remains from this ancient world is not merely a collection of bones and impressions in rock. It is a record of how life responds to extraordinary conditions, how ecosystems organize themselves under pressure, and how the interplay between environment and biology produces outcomes that cannot be predicted from either alone. The story of ancient Australia is, at its foundation, a story about what happens when the rules change, when the conditions that govern life across most of the planet are suspended and replaced by something different, something more demanding, and something that pushes evolution in directions it has not been required to explore. The inverted predator hierarchy, with its close combat apex hunters and its downsized variants of the giants that dominated elsewhere, was not an arbitrary outcome. It was the logical product of an environment where confined spaces, dense vegetation, fragmented habitats, and intense competition favored a particular style of predation over others. The sophisticated herbivore communities, with their complex social behaviors and their dental adaptations for processing difficult vegetation, were not random developments but direct responses to a landscape where food was variable, seasonal, and obtained at significant risk. The diverse crocodilomorphs, the active pterosaurs, the advanced small theropods with their enhanced senses, all occupied roles that reflected the specific demands of this particular world. Each of these elements arose from the combination of forces that defined ancient Australia. The southern position, the Gondwanan heritage, the progressive isolation, the inland seas, the seasonal darkness, the climatic variability, all of these factors combined to create an environment that selected for particular solutions to universal biological problems. The solutions that emerged were different from those found elsewhere not because the underlying biology was different, but because the questions being asked by the environment were different, and different questions produced different answers. The legacy of this world extends beyond the boundaries of the Cretaceous period. The lineages that survived the transformation of the Australian landscape carried forward traits that had been forged under the most demanding conditions the southern world had to offer. As the continent continued its northward drift, as its climate changed, as its connections to other landmasses remained severed, these inherited traits continued to influence the direction of evolution, contributing to the development of the distinctive modern Australian biota that would eventually capture the imagination of a world that did not yet know the deep history from which it had emerged. The modern animals of Australia, remarkable for their distinctiveness, and for their differences from the fauna of other continents, are not simply products of recent isolation. They are the most recent expression of a biological heritage that stretches back to a time when this continent was pressed against the southern pole, draped in darkness for months at a time, fragmented by seas that came and went without permanence, and inhabited by creatures that had learned to survive under conditions that no other continent demanded. The uniqueness of modern Australian wildlife is not a recent development. It is the current chapter of a story that began in the deep Cretaceous, shaped by forces that have been influencing life here for more than 100 million years. Understanding this deep history changes how we see the present. The isolation that defines Australia today is not a recent accident of geography, but a continuation of a process that began when this landmass first started to separate from its Gondwanan neighbors. The biological distinctiveness that characterizes Australian life is not a superficial peculiarity, but a profound reflection of a unique evolutionary trajectory shaped by conditions unlike those experienced by life on any other continent. The rules that were broken in the Cretaceous remain broken today, expressed in different forms but originating from the same fundamental cause, a continent that has been following its own path through time for longer than most of us can easily imagine. The science that studies this world is still young, and the discoveries that remain to be made are potentially as significant as those already achieved. Every expedition to the fossil-bearing formations of Australia carries the possibility of finding something that will reshape understanding of what lived here and how. Every new analytical technique offers the potential to extract previously inaccessible information from material that has already been collected. The story of ancient Australia is far from fully told, and the chapters that remain to be written may prove to be among the most extraordinary in the entire narrative of life on Earth. What we can say, based on what has been discovered so far, is that this ancient world was one of the most remarkable ecosystems the planet has ever produced. Its creatures were unlike those found anywhere else. Its ecological structures defied the patterns seen across the rest of the globe. Its environmental conditions were more extreme, more variable, and more demanding than those faced by life on other continents during the same period. And yet life not only survived here but thrived, finding ways to persist, adapt, and diversify under pressures that should by every conventional expectation have limited it severely. This is the fundamental lesson of ancient Australia, that life does not simply endure extraordinary conditions. It is shaped by them, transformed by them, and ultimately made more remarkable by them. The creatures that inhabited this dark, flooded, fragmenting southern world were not diminished versions of their counterparts elsewhere. They were something altogether different, products of a place that demanded more and that received, in response, solutions of startling creativity and resilience. The rock that holds their remains is patient. It has waited for 100 million years and more, holding within its layers the evidence of a world that challenged everything we thought we understood about how life organizes itself. As we continue to read that record, with tools that grow more powerful and questions that grow more precise, the story that emerges grows richer, more detailed, and more astonishing with every passing year. Ancient Australia broke the rules, and in doing so, it taught us something essential about the rules themselves, that they are not fixed laws of nature but contingent patterns, shaped by circumstances and capable of producing very different outcomes when circumstances change. This is the world that used to be Australia, and it was extraordinary.